There is a moment, and if you have ever lived through it, you already know exactly what I am pointing to. It does not arrive loudly or in a dramatic way. It comes quietly, almost like something subtle shifting inside reality itself, like a dim room slowly getting a little brighter after being dark for too long. You begin to notice you are no longer reacting the same way you used to. The things that once pulled you into emotional chaos no longer have the same grip. You stop rushing to explain yourself over and over again. You stop apologizing for things that were never truly your fault. You stop making yourself smaller just so someone else can feel larger, more powerful, more in control. And in that quiet space, in that unfamiliar stillness that feels both new and slightly uncomfortable, something important happens. Someone notices. This someone is a person who was used to a version of you that was easier to move, easier to confuse, easier to shake. A version of you who could be pulled into doubt, pulled into guilt, pulled into emotional confusion without much resistance. They built a kind of psychological comfort on the assumption that you would always stay emotionally reachable, always stay responsive, always stay available to be pulled back into old patterns. And then they look at you again, and something is different. Your energy is not the same. Your reactions are not the same. Your presence feels steadier, quieter, less available to manipulation. And in that moment, something inside them shifts too. Not in a healthy way, not in a peaceful way, but in a way that feels threatening to the system they built around you. What I am describing here is not guesswork or abstract theory. It is a pattern that shows up in real psychological dynamics when someone who relied on control starts losing it. When a narcissistic type of personality realizes, not just logically, but deeply, that the person they were engaging with is no longer easy to manipulate, something begins to break in their internal balance. And what follows after that realization is not always what people expect. There is usually one final phase, one last attempt to regain influence. And if you are not aware of it, it can feel surprisingly convincing, even after everything you have already been through. There comes a point in the experience of anyone who has been emotionally entangled in this kind of dynamic where something inside them becomes exhausted in a deeper way. Not the kind of exhaustion that means giving up, but the kind that feels like waking up. It is as if you finally reach the bottom of emotional confusion. You sit there long enough that the bottom stops feeling like chaos and starts feeling like clarity. And from that place, something in you starts to reorganize itself naturally. The part of you that was constantly trying to understand them begins to quiet down. The part of you that was always analyzing their moods, their shifts, their distance, their unpredictability starts to lose energy. You stop replaying conversations in your mind late at night, trying to find hidden meanings. You stop waiting for the apology that never came and was never really coming. You stop trying to fix something that was never designed to be fixed through your effort alone. And without fully realizing it at first, you begin to withdraw your emotional investment. This withdrawal is extremely important. Even if it did not feel powerful while it was happening, even if it felt like emptiness or emotional numbness or loss, it is actually a turning point. Because to the person who was feeding on your reactions, your attention, your emotional engagement, this withdrawal is immediately noticeable. Narcissistic personalities are not necessarily tuned into empathy in the way healthy relationships require, but they are highly tuned into attention, response, emotional availability, and energetic focus. So when your energy starts to shift, when your urgency disappears, when your explanations become fewer, when your emotional chasing stops, they feel it. It is not something they consciously calculate at first. It is more like an internal alarm system reacting to absence. The atmosphere changes for them. The emotional pressure they were used to receiving from you is no longer there in the same way. And this creates discomfort, irritation, and eventually panic, even if they try to hide it. Your healing is not invisible to them. Your emotional independence is not unnoticed. The moment you start to reclaim yourself, something in their internal structure begins to destabilize. Because in their internal psychology, you were never just a neutral person. You were a source of validation, attention, emotional reaction, and psychological supply. And when that supply begins to reduce, their sense of control begins to weaken. So they start adjusting. At first, it is subtle. They observe you more carefully. They test what still works and what no longer works. They might try old patterns that used to pull you back in, like guilt, emotional withdrawal, confusion, or indirect provocation. But when those strategies stop producing the same results, something shifts again. They realize the old methods are losing power. This is the point where a more advanced strategy often begins, and it is much harder to recognize because it does not look like conflict anymore. It does not look like aggression or punishment. It does not look like obvious manipulation at first glance. Instead, it often looks like change. They begin to present a version of themselves that appears different, more reflective, more calm, more self-aware. They may use words that sound responsible. They may acknowledge past behavior in a way that feels surprisingly honest. They may speak in a softer tone, express regret, or describe personal growth. On the surface, this can look like real transformation. But in many cases, what is happening is not genuine internal change. It is a carefully constructed performance designed to regain emotional access. It is a response built from observation. They have watched what made you pull away. They have learned what language resonates with your boundaries, your values, your emotional sensitivities. And now they begin to mirror that back to you in a way that feels tailored specifically to your experience. This is what makes it so dangerous emotionally, because it is not random. It is not careless. It is not chaotic like earlier stages often were. It feels structured. It feels thoughtful. It feels like understanding. And because it touches the part of you that always wanted things to finally make sense, it can feel strangely believable. They may say things that sound like accountability. They may describe your pain in a way that shows awareness. They may appear to understand exactly what went wrong. And in doing so, they create a space that feels emotionally safer than before, a space that resembles the thing you were always hoping would exist. This is where many people feel a pull again, not because they are weak, but because they are human, because hope is a natural response to the idea of repair, because the mind wants closure, because the heart remembers what it once tried to build. And when someone presents a version of change that feels real enough, that hope can activate again very quickly. But underneath this performance, the core dynamic has not necessarily changed. What has changed is strategy. The purpose is still to regain emotional access, to reestablish influence, to reconnect you to the old cycle where your emotional reactions could be used again. The packaging is different, but the underlying objective often remains the same. To understand this clearly, you have to look at what your withdrawal actually represents to them. When someone like this loses control over you, it is not just about losing a relationship. It is about losing part of the psychological structure they built around your reactions, your attention, your emotional responses, your presence in their orbit, all played a role in supporting their internal sense of importance. So when you step away, it does not just feel like rejection. It feels like destabilization. It challenges their internal narrative about superiority, control, and emotional dominance. It creates a gap where their influence used to be. And that gap is uncomfortable, sometimes even intolerable. This is why the final attempt often becomes more refined, because at that stage, they are not just trying random tactics anymore. They are trying precision. They are trying to recreate the emotional conditions that once kept you engaged. They are trying to speak directly to your empathy, your memories, your desire for resolution. And if this attempt does not work, something else happens internally for them. A deeper frustration sets in because your continued independence becomes proof of something they struggle to accept, that their influence over you is no longer absolute, that your emotional world is no longer revolving around them, that you have become capable of existing, thinking, and moving forward without their involvement. This is where the psychological discomfort becomes more intense for them, because it is not just about losing you anymore. It is about being confronted with the reality that you can outgrow the dynamic itself. And that realization can create a kind of internal instability that pushes them toward either stronger attempts or complete withdrawal, depending on the person. At its core, what you are witnessing is not just a relationship change. It is a shift in power, attention, and emotional control. And once that shift begins, it rarely returns to its original form. That underneath all the outward display and behavior, they are still ordinary, still breakable, still not as powerful as they try to appear. And you, by stepping away and keeping your self-respect intact, quietly proved that truth without needing to say it out loud. So this final strategy is not only about trying to pull you back in, it is also about trying to fix their own inner balance again. It is about making themselves feel in control once more, about convincing themselves that they still have influence over you, that they can still affect your emotions, your decisions, your direction. If these words are feeling useful to you, if something in this message feels familiar or accurate in a deep way that you cannot ignore, then it is worth remembering that this kind of reflection is shared regularly here for understanding patterns like this more clearly. Many people pass these ideas on because they recognize how important it can be for someone's awareness and clarity. After the first stage of approach, where everything may look changed, softened, or improved, and after the carefully shaped version of emotional behavior they present, there almost always comes another stage. This is the second phase, where the surface begins to show small, weak points, almost invisible at first, because real inner change can continue without breaking. But a performance, no matter how carefully it is maintained, always starts to strain under pressure. At some point, the effort needed to keep up the act becomes heavier than what they are willing or able to maintain. And when you do not respond the way they expect, when you do not fall back into old patterns, when you stay kind but still firm, something begins to build underneath their control. Slowly, tension forms behind the mask, and then it starts to show in very small ways. At first, it might be just slight irritation when you do not reply in the emotional tone they were hoping for, or a subtle change in how they speak when they notice your boundaries are still present, or moments where old patterns of avoiding responsibility appear again